Hello. Tonight, we will discuss the near-disastrous Apollo 11 mission. It's the early morning of May 25th, 1961. President John F. Kennedy stands before a joint session of Congress. His words are calm but electrifying. I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal, before this decade is out, of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth. The challenge was breathtaking. At the time, the United States had only sent one man into space, Alan Shepard, and that mission had lasted just 15 minutes. Yet here was the president declaring that within a mere 8.5 years, an American would set foot on another celestial body. The race was on. To land a human on the moon required the largest engineering project in human history. At the heart of the mission would be the Saturn V, a towering 363-foot rocket, still the most powerful ever launched. It was designed by a team led by German-American aerospace engineer Wernher von Braun, who had previously developed Germany's V-2 rockets in double high puree. The Saturn V had 3 stages. Stage 1, SIC, 5 enormous F-1 engines producing 7.5 million pounds of thrust. Its job, blast the rocket through the lower atmosphere. Stage 2, S2, 5 J-2 engines ignited after Stage 1 separation to push Apollo toward space. Stage 3, SIVB, 1 J-2 engine that completed the journey to Earth orbit and later reignited to send Apollo on its way to the moon. The spacecraft atop the rocket was just as complex. Command Module, CM, named Columbia, it was the only part to return to Earth. Designed for re-entry and housing the astronauts during launch, transit, and return. Service Module, SM, carried fuel, oxygen, power, and the engine for course corrections. Lunar Module, LM, named Eagle, it would separate in lunar orbit and land on the moon with 2 of the 3 astronauts aboard. The entire system was tested over a series of progressively more ambitious Apollo missions. Apollo 7 proved the command module, Apollo 8 orbited the moon, Apollo 9 tested the lunar module in Earth orbit, and Apollo 10 rehearsed nearly everything, descending to just 8.4 nautical miles above the moon's surface. Then came Apollo 11. 3 men were selected for the honor of the first moon landing. Neil A. Armstrong, commander, a quiet, composed former Navy pilot and engineer who had flown the Gemini 8 mission. He would be the first to step onto the lunar surface. Edwin E. Buzz Aldrin, lunar module pilot, a brilliant mechanical engineer and Air Force colonel, he held a doctorate from MIT. Michael Collins, command module pilot, the man who would orbit the moon alone while Armstrong and Aldrin walked its surface. These astronauts underwent years of preparation, simulations, emergency drills, and detailed technical study. Armstrong, for example, practiced hundreds of lunar module landings in the dangerous Lunar Landing Training Vehicle, LLTV, which could hover like the real lander would. July 16, 1969, 9:32 a.m. EDT, Cape Kennedy, Florida. As nearly 1 million spectators watched from the ground, and millions more through televisions worldwide, the Saturn V roars to life. The launch sequence is perfectly timed. T-minus 6 seconds, engines ignite. T0, hold down arms release. The rocket climbs slowly at first, building momentum as it clears the launch tower. It takes just 12 minutes to reach Earth orbit. After a systems check and 1 full orbit, the 3rd stage reignites and sends Apollo 11 on its translunar injection. the path toward the moon. The crew now prepares for transposition and docking, a delicate maneuver where the command module turns 180 degrees to dock with the lunar module, still stowed in the SIV-B stage. This step is essential. It allows the astronauts access to the lander for the later descent. The next 3 days are spent in coasting flight toward the moon, filled with technical checks, meal times, communication with Houston, and awe-filled glimpses of Earth shrinking in the blackness behind them. It's July 19th, 1969. After more than 3 days of flight through space, the Apollo 11 spacecraft enters the moon's gravitational influence. At 76 hours into the mission, the service module's engine ignites for the lunar orbit insertion, LOI, burn. This crucial maneuver slows the spacecraft down, allowing it to be captured into orbit around the moon. The burn lasts 6 minutes. When complete, Apollo 11 is locked in an elliptical orbit ranging from 69 to 190 miles above the lunar surface. In the next orbit, a second engine burn circularizes the path at 66 by 54 miles. Now, in lunar orbit, the crew begins reconnoitering the intended landing site, the Sea of Tranquility, or Mare Tranquillitatis. This relatively flat, dark basaltic plain was selected based on its safety. Few large boulders or steep slopes, and good lighting conditions at the time of arrival. From orbit, the astronauts marvel at the lunar landscape. Craters stretch to the horizon, and the sun casts long, sharp shadows across the ancient regolith. Michael Collins, tasked with piloting the command module Columbia, will remain in orbit alone while Armstrong and Aldrin descend to the surface. On July 20th, 1969, at 100 hours into the mission, Armstrong and Aldrin climb into the lunar module Eagle. The two crafts separate cleanly. As the LM drifts free of Columbia, Collins radios, "You cats take it easy on the lunar surface. If I hear you huffing and puffing, I'm going to start complaining." With the command module now in orbit alone, Eagle begins its slow descent. The landing is a two-part process. First, a descent orbit insertion, DOI, burn lowers the LM to an elliptical orbit, bringing its perigee down to about 50,000 feet. Then, at 50,000 feet above the moon's surface, the powered descent initiation, PDI, begins. The lunar module's descent engine fires up. From now on, every second counts. Eagle starts descending on autopilot. Armstrong and Aldrin monitor the gauges as the LM pitches over, giving them their first view of the landing site. But soon, unexpected alarms begin to flash. 1202 and 1201 program alarms. These alarms signal that the onboard guidance computer is overloaded. Back in Houston, flight controllers scramble. One of them, a young engineer named Steve Bales, confers with computer specialist Jack Garman and quickly gives the go-ahead. "We'll go on that alarm, flight." The descent continues, but they're off course by about 4 miles. As the LM gets lower, Armstrong sees that their targeted area is littered with boulders and craters. He takes manual control. Fuel is running dangerously low. Aldrin calls out data, 60 seconds, then 30. Armstrong is focused, scanning for a safe place. Just 20 feet above the surface, the LM drifts forward at just under 1 foot per second. Then, dust kicks up. Contact light glows. "Houston, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed." Capcom Charlie Duke in Houston lets out a relieved breath and responds, "Roger, Tranquility. We copy you on the ground. You got a bunch of guys about to turn blue. We're breathing again. Thanks a lot." They landed with only 17 seconds of fuel remaining. The plan called for a rest period before the moonwalk, but Armstrong and Aldrin, running on adrenaline and excitement, request to go ahead with the extravehicular activity, EVA, early. Inside the LM, they don their bulky A7L pressure suits, check their portable life support systems, PLSS, and depressurize the cabin. Armstrong carefully backs down the ladder. Outside is a world untouched by life, ancient and silent. The lunar dust, regolith, is dark, gray, and extremely fine, like powdered charcoal. Armstrong reaches the footpad and announces, "I'm going to step off the LM now." And with that, at 10:56 p.m. EDT, July 20th, 1969, Neil Armstrong becomes the first human to set foot on the moon. That's one small step for a man, one giant leap for mankind. He describes the surface, fine-grained, almost like powder, yet firm underfoot. Buzz Aldrin soon follows, calling the view magnificent desolation. The two men begin their planned tasks, collecting contingency soil samples, deploying experiments, and taking photographs. Among the gear they place on the surface, the passive seismic experiment to monitor moonquakes, the laser-ranging retroreflector, which is still used today to measure the distance between the Earth and Moon with astonishing precision. A U.S. flag carefully unfurled and planted near the LM, a plaque on the LM's descent stage, reading, "Here men from the planet Earth first set foot upon the moon, July 1969, A.D., we came in peace for all mankind." They speak with President Nixon by radio, who tells them, for one priceless moment in the whole history of man, all the people on this earth are truly one. After 2.5 hours on the surface and 21 hours on the moon total, Armstrong and Aldrin re-enter Eagle, seal the hatch, and begin preparations to return to orbit. The lunar module's ascent stage lifts off using a small hypergolic engine. The bottom half, the descent stage, remains on the moon, a permanent relic. Rendezvousing with Columbia in orbit requires precision. Aldrin performs manual navigation using stars and a sextant. After docking with the command module, they transfer the samples and equipment and jettison Eagle. Then, they fire the service module engine one final time for the trans-Earth injection, TEI, the burn that propels them away from lunar gravity and back toward home. As Apollo 11 coasts home through the vast silence of space, the crew conducts final system checks, captures photographs of Earth growing larger, and reflects on the monumental events behind them. But the journey is not yet over. One of the most dangerous phases of the mission remains: re-entry into Earth's atmosphere. The service module, which has powered the spacecraft throughout its voyage, is now no longer needed. It's jettisoned and sent tumbling into space. Only the command module, Columbia, shaped like a blunt cone and coated in ablative heat shield material, will return to Earth. The crew straps in. At 44,000 kilometers per hour, 27,000 mph, the capsule hits the top of Earth's atmosphere. The friction is enormous. Temperatures on the heat shield spike to over 2,500 degrees, 4,900 degrees. The heat shield begins to vaporize, carrying the heat away in glowing plasma that envelops the spacecraft, cutting off radio contact for several minutes. Mission Control waits in silence. For 3 minutes, there is no signal. Then, "Columbia, this is Houston, reading you loud and clear." Apollo 11 has made it through. The spacecraft deploys a sequence of parachutes, first 2 small drogue chutes, then 3 massive main parachutes, each 83 feet across. They slow the capsule's descent to under 20 millipole at 12:50 p.m. EDT on July 24, 1969, Columbia splashes down in the Pacific Ocean, 812 nautical miles southwest of Hawaii. U.S. Navy recovery ships are waiting. A helicopter from the USS Hornet hovers overhead. Frog men from the recovery team jump into the water, secure the capsule, and inflate flotation collars. The astronauts, still in their suits, emerge and are handed biological isolation garments, a precaution in case of lunar microbes. They are hoisted aboard the helicopter and flown to the deck of the Hornet, greeted by President Nixon, who waves at them through a window as the astronauts are now inside a sealed quarantine trailer called the Mobile Quarantine Facility, MQF. Why quarantine? Though unlikely, NASA scientists considered the possibility that lunar material might carry unknown pathogens. For 3 weeks, Armstrong, Aldrin, and Collins remained in isolation, monitored closely, as were the samples and equipment brought back from the moon. No alien microbes were found, but this cautious approach became a defining example of the planetary protection protocols still used today. Once released from quarantine, the Apollo 11 astronauts were celebrated worldwide. Parades were held in New York City, Chicago, and Los Angeles. They embarked on a global goodwill tour called the Giant Leap Tour, visiting 24 countries and meeting world leaders. Everywhere they went, crowds cheered. These weren't just American heroes. They were global icons. For a moment in time, humanity had looked beyond borders and gazed outward together. One of the most scientifically valuable returns from Apollo 11 was the lunar sample collection, about 47.5 pounds, 21.5 clear, of rocks, soil, and core samples. These were sealed in vacuum-tight containers and meticulously analyzed back on Earth. What scientists found was astonishing. Basaltic rocks suggesting past volcanic activity. Regolith full of tiny glass beads created by ancient meteor impacts. A complete lack of organic material. The moon was sterile. The samples showed that the moon's surface was extremely old. Some of the oldest rocks dated back 3.6 billion years, even older than much of Earth's own surface, which is constantly recycled by tectonic activity. Also deployed were scientific experiments. The laser-ranging retroreflector still allows scientists to measure the Earth-Moon distance with millimeter precision. The passive seismic experiment detected lunar quakes and impacts, revealing that the moon has tectonic activity, though far weaker than Earth's. The success of Apollo 11 wasn't just a political triumph. It triggered technological advances that continue to shape our world. Many of the systems developed for Apollo became foundational to later innovation. Integrated circuits and miniaturized electronics spurred the computer revolution. The need for advanced materials gave rise to lightweight composites, now used in aviation, sports gear, and even medical devices. Space-grade insulation, water purification systems, and telemetry protocols all found civilian applications. More importantly, Apollo inspired an entire generation of scientists, engineers, and dreamers. School children who watched Armstrong walk on the moon in 1969 grew up to lead space shuttle launches, Mars rover missions, and telescope deployments. Apollo also fundamentally shifted our perspective on Earth. From space, our planet appeared as a fragile blue sphere, tiny, alone, and precious. The environmental movement of the 1970s was in part driven by this new cosmic awareness. Though Apollo 11 was a triumph, it was just the beginning of lunar exploration. Apollo 12 followed in November 1969, landing within walking distance of an earlier unmanned surveyor probe. Apollo 13 famously suffered an explosion en route but returned safely in a gripping survival story. Apollo 14 through 17 carried out increasingly complex missions, with the final one, Apollo 17, taking place in 1972. Each brought back more samples, ran new experiments, and revealed new layers of lunar history. But after 1972, the Apollo program ended. Budget cuts, shifting priorities, and waning public interest closed the chapter on lunar exploration for the time being. When Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins finally returned to Earth, each carried within him a profoundly personal transformation. The moon mission had not simply changed the course of history, it had changed the men who lived it. Neil Armstrong, always the most reserved of the trio, rarely spoke of his personal emotions surrounding the moon landing. His demeanor during the mission had been methodical, composed, almost stoic, but not detached. Rather, Armstrong's focus was absolute. Every checklist completed, every maneuver executed, every word chosen. Each was an act of discipline and respect for the magnitude of what they were doing. Yet, in quieter moments, Armstrong reflected more deeply. In interviews years later, he admitted that what struck him most wasn't the barrenness of the moon, but the fragility of Earth. It suddenly struck me that that tiny pea, pretty and blue, was the Earth. I put up my thumb and shut one eye, and my thumb blotted out the planet Earth. I didn't feel like a giant. I felt very, very small. To Armstrong, the moon was not simply a destination. It was a lens through which humanity might better understand its home and itself. He would go on to avoid the spotlight, preferring a quieter life as an educator and engineer. Fame never sat comfortably with him. The mission to him had always been about collective achievement, not personal glory. Buzz Aldrin, by contrast, was more outspoken and contemplative. The second man on the moon saw the experience through both a technical and spiritual lens. As an MIT-trained engineer and fighter pilot, Aldrin had a deep understanding of the machine that carried him. But he also saw in the moon a symbol, a destination that had been imagined in myth and dreamed of in science fiction for millennia. Before exiting the LM, Aldrin asked for a moment of silence. He quietly took communion with a tiny chalice and wafer, a private act of gratitude and reflection that few knew about at the time. In later years, Aldrin would write of the moment. It was interesting to think the very first liquid ever poured on the moon and the very first food eaten there were communion elements. He spoke often of the magnificent desolation of the lunar surface. Those words were not poetic invention. They were the honest sum of his emotional experience. The moon was grand and bleak, awe-inspiring, and utterly lifeless. It made Earth feel alive by contrast. In the years after Apollo, Aldrin struggled with the disorienting effect of sudden fame and the abrupt end of his flying career. He would later speak openly about his battles with depression and alcoholism, becoming a powerful advocate for mental health among astronauts and veterans. But Buzz never stopped looking skyward. He became a tireless promoter of space exploration, Mars missions, and international cooperation in the cosmos. Michael Collins, the command module pilot who remained in lunar orbit, played an equally critical role. Without him, Armstrong and Aldrin would have had no ride home. For over 21 hours, while the lunar module was on the surface, Collins orbited alone, utterly isolated, even from a radio contact for parts of each orbit. At the far side of the moon, with no one to talk to, not Earth, not Eagle, Collins was the most alone any human had ever been. I am alone now, truly alone and absolutely isolated from any known life. I am it. Yet Collins did not feel fear. In his memoir, Carrying the Fire, he described these solitary laps as peaceful, even comforting. He trusted the systems, he trusted his training, and he trusted his crewmates. Collins, too, would step back from the limelight after the mission. He became director of the National Air and Space Museum in Washington, helping build what would become one of the most visited museums in the world. In speeches, he often emphasized that while Neil and Buzz had walked on the moon, all three of them had made the journey. And more than that, they had done it for all of humanity.